Hi, my name is Kerry Chun, and this is my History Senior capstone about Issei identity expression during the World War II Japanese-American internment experience. But first, here are a few things.
First, the Issei refers to the first generation of Japanese immigrants to the United States.
And most importantly, my capstone failed in combining the two disciplines of history and sociology anthropology, which are my two majors in case you're wondering why those two fields of study. In my paper, I focused too much on the cultural expression of ethnic identity rather than specific historical evidence from documents. I faced difficulties framing this in a historical context. I got my sources from 3 memoirs written by interned Issei during this time period. Now, you might be asking yourself and me, why is this presentation important? And why should I sit here for about 10 minutes listening to you? Well, let me ask you this. How many of you have learned about the World War II bombing of Pearl Harbor? If you answered yes, let me ask you a follow-up question. Were you taught about Executive Order 9066 and its immediate extensive impact on the Japanese American community? In the average American classroom, it is common for teachers to not educate their students about the World War II Japanese American internment experience. They generally just cover the significance of the bombing of the key naval base Pearl Harbor on the island of Oahu. Additionally, this topic has significance because the Issei are not a heavily pursued focus of Japanese American research. The focus is primarily on the Nisei, and I will add, I also have a personal connection to this topic because my grandfather was among those interned. Additionally, the sources that I used were from a 3-book series published by the Japanese Cultural Center of Hawaii. The sources are Family Torn Apart, Internment Odyssey Haisho 1010, and Life Behind Barbed Wire, Teisaku Seikatsu. I will present my topic of Issei identity with evidence drawn from the memoirs written by these 3 deceased Issei men. And I argued because the Issei felt the negative perception from the American government and its society, they maintained their group identity, culture, norms, and values to help cope with their internment experience. And here's a brief crash course. On July 8th, 1868, Commodore Matthew Perry, this guy, forced open the self-isolated nation of Japan to the West and foreign trade at the Tokyo Bay. 1868 is also important because this was the era of Meiji and its Meiji Restoration, a westernization and modernization movement that sent Japanese students and government workers all over the globe to gather knowledge of the West and their technology. In this same exact year, King David Kalakaua allowed 168 Japanese contract workers to work on the sugarcane plantation in his kingdom of Hawaii. This first wave of Japanese migrants were originally called the Ganemono. However, scholars later called them the Issei. Later, United States government officials also supported this migration of Japanese laborers to the islands of Hawaii because, according to Dr. William Hillebrand, commissioner of the Bureau of Immigration in the 1860s, the Japanese were desirable because they were akin to the Hawaiians. I do not fully grasp the logic behind this, but that's what it was. And now for the most important date of them all. Fast forward quite a great deal of years later. On December 7th, 1941, Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, a key American naval base. This naval base is located on the island of Oahu. Here are some pictures from that day that I'm slowly flipping through, supposedly. And as a side note, I wanted to note that the island of Hawaii is actually a real island. They just stuck the label of Hawaii on the state and then made it into an umbrella term for all 8 islands, but this is the real island of Hawaii. And getting back on track, a year later, Executive Order 9066 was signed by President Franklin D. Roosevelt for the immediate incarceration of all suspicious Japanese persons. This is the guy. Now, the people who detained were, of course, of Japanese ancestry, and they were almost always leaders of the Japanese American community, school teachers, religious leaders, and Issei. This directive sent a bad message to the Japanese American communities because the public now saw the Japanese as the public enemy. They were being rejected from American society. So they couldn't become American citizens because America did not like them. The Americanization movement was another obstacle to Issei identity because they aimed to suppress and rid America of everything Japanese related. They wanted them to become more American. Anything Japanese, like language, customs, etc., was seen as an effort to Japanize the United States and make America more undemocratic. The Nisei also proved to be in opposition to Issei identity because the Nisei faced a dilemma. They grew up immersed in American culture. They wanted to achieve the American dream and be accepted as American citizens, but their parents, in their eyes, were an obstacle to that because they represented everything and anything all Japanese. So they tried to take over the JACL leadership, which is not a topic we are discussing in this presentation. These song lyrics are a very accurate example of Issei reaction to the internment. For example, the line "mounting hardship burdens us" explicitly acknowledges that the Issei struggled in camp life or that they accepted the impending struggles that were to come. Now, during internment, a key core way of expression of Issei identity was their collectivist practices. Now you may be asking, what is collectivism? Collectivism is the ideology that places the self-needs of the groups before the self-needs of the individual. It's a teamwork mentality. This mentality is interwoven into much of the cultural practices, norms, and value systems of the Japanese. The Issei expressed this in camp life by creating order to their initial incarceration. They created a hierarchy where everyone had roles to better be organized and uplift the welfare of the group, like camp captains who kept order within each camp barrack. For example, Furuya recalled how the internees had appointed the title barracks captain to the group leader of each camp barrack, the title spokesman to the individual who would speak for the group, and the title coordinator to the head of the entire camp. These roles were a very important part of maintaining order and normalcy in camp life. Again, this is going to sound redundant, but they expressed this part of their identity to preserve their Japanese identity and also create a sense of normalcy. They used it in some ways as a coping mechanism to restore normalcy to their life, if that makes sense. Additionally, collectivism allowed for the perpetuation of cultural practices, values, and beliefs such as Oshogatsu, the New Year's, Shinto Buddhism, and the celebration of the emperor's birthday. The group celebration of this increased group solidarity, and they found comfort in each other while incarcerated. Alright, so letters. Letters were an important form of communication for the interned Issei because through these letters, family ties were maintained. For example, a family would write to each other to update everyone about current and new events going on, and to check in with each other to see if a family member needed assistance in any way, shape, or form. These letters also served as care packages because these letters would be sent with small packages of Japanese cooking ingredients, traditional clothing, and money. And because they sent these care packages to each other, and in some ways this was collectivism being expressed. They were raising the welfare of their family members and others in the community, which increases the group identity in terms of solidarity that they found in each other. Their identity strengthened because they became their own support group. The Issei also expressed their identity in other ways, such as the press, poetry, and through everyday slang. Many interned Issei also used their camp newspaper presses and radio broadcasting stations as outlets for their Japanese identity. For example, these presses and broadcasting groups provided the voice for internees to display a connection to their home country in both English and Japanese. Newspaper and radio stations often broadcasted news from Japan, from their home communities, and within camp. Furuya described the formation of Fort Missoula's broadcasting department. He stated that the department listened to the Japanese news and ultimately kept them informed. He also noted they gathered the news that even the local papers never reported. In addition, these newspaper stations and radio broadcasting stations would broadcast songs that the internees would sing together to create a sort of team, family, groups, identity, environment type of thing. Similar to Furuya and Ozaki, many Issei had constructed poems to voice what they could not voice in the present situation that they were in. Central to their Japanese identity, Furuya and Ozaki's poems were originally composed in Japanese before they were translated into English way later on. These poems describe their daily struggles, hardships, and sources of salvation. They also made comparisons to things from Japan in their everyday life. The poem displayed on the screen is one of Ozaki's poems that was in his radio transcript that described the Japanese versus American identity conflict. In addition to the newspaper and radio broadcasting stations, the Issei had also established a council for both Buddhism and Shinto religious sects at their camps. Spiritual ties was another way in which the Issei maintained and expressed their identity. In his memoir, Furuya listed the numbers who were on each canto at the Santa Fe internment camp. Additionally, they celebrated the Shinto tradition of Oshogatsu, which is New Year's, when it was commonly practiced in almost all internment camp sites. For example, the Kadomatsu was constructed from tall pine trees from the mountains. These were decorations set up at the doors of reception halls or personal spaces of the internees to celebrate and welcome the kami, or the gods, into the new year. The Issei also expressed their identity through art. In the case of this example, which is through religious means, Soga detailed the construction of 2 art exhibitions during his time at the Lordsburg's camp. These 2 exhibits were made by 2 internees themselves. One was a zushi, a miniature Buddhist shrine that often encased a deity, and a haiden, a Shinto shrine worship hall. In particular, the haiden was constructed from a big drum covered in duck and caricatures of the interned persons. This also made the Issei and other Japanese internees, who were not Issei, feel connection to the Shinto goddess Amaterasu, which traced to the lineage of the Japanese emperor, which was a way for the Issei to connect themselves directly to Japan. For many Issei, their Japanese identity was a source of pride. Many of them did not want to bend to the pressure exerted by the United States government, the American public, or their own children, the Nisei, to abandon their identity and conform to the American way, basically assimilate to American culture. During the internment of the Issei and other Japanese Americans, the Issei felt attacked because their core identity was being visibly rejected by Executive Order 9066 and being labeled America's public enemy number 1. To combat all this negative pressure from society and the public, which is basically the same thing, collectivist-based practices were reinforced in everyday camp life. These practices increased their group solidarity in each other in ways such as language, activities, and religion. This ideology promoted a team mindset, which reinforced and encouraged the continuation of their traditional Japanese values and practices because they would do everything together as a group. Through this collectivist ideology, or perpetuation of this ideology and its many practices within, most Issei were able to retain their Japanese American identity, or Japanese identity, and survive World War II despite being seen as the enemy. Their identity ultimately served as the constant source of normalcy during the internment experience. Thank you for your time and for putting up with my horrible English skills at the end there.